2022. So my name is Walid Houri. I'm a professor in the Department of Biochemistry at the University of Toronto. And on behalf of the organizers of LSCE 2022, I want to welcome everyone from Canada and internationally to this very exciting meeting. So I want to say good morning, good noon, good afternoon, and good evening, since we have people from all over the place. So before we begin today, I want to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates for thousands of years. It has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So I'm also going to play a video that will help us reflect on this.
Ani, bonjour. Sarah Rockendish Nakaz. Shebenaning and Donjaba, Takaranto and Dai. Takaranto, a Mohawk word, the place in the water where the trees are standing, the place where the fish weirs are. My dog and I spend a lot of time walking. It's my favorite way to move through this city. For me, it's a meditative action that isn't about negotiating bike lanes or public transit, but a time to slow down and really try to see the world around me. Concrete sidewalks, parking lots, now covering the rivers and trails that once flowed freely. The Petun, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Métis, the Mississaugas all made their homes here, and many other nations expanding beyond these groups traveled through for commerce and trade for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. I think of the other First Peoples languages and the names they had for this place. I think of the ancient trails covered by the pressures of settlement. The waterways and the moderate climate of the Great Lakes made it a perfect place to fish, hunt, grow food, gather medicines and seeds for horticultural development. Rich, fertile, and abundant, Turtle Island's Mesopotamia. Many First Peoples and their goods traveled from here all the way to the Mississippi and back. Whenever I travel somewhere new, I try to find out whose land I'm on, and I ask, who are the original occupants here? So for Indigenous peoples, land acknowledgements are not only to assert our sovereignty and treaty rights of today, but it's also a way for all peoples to feel more connected to a place. Davenport might be a street now, one I walk down regularly in my neighborhood, but it's not just another thoroughfare. For me, it's an ancient portage trail that holds Indigenous knowledge. They say the animals made the first trails that led them to water, and the people followed. I imagine the deer and the moose once made this trail, followed by the people carrying their birch bark canoes, carrying their goods to trade and bringing stories to tell. Nations from all over Turtle Island met and traveled through this land. Many languages were spoken. Alliances and decisions were made. People from different nations met and intermarried. The dish with one spoon treaty was made. Takaranto was a meeting place and land made up of sophisticated and cosmopolitan peoples and cultures that I see reflected in the city today. I wonder, is it something in the land and the water? Land acknowledgements might seem like a small and simple gesture, but like many of our ways, they are intended to have more impact and hold more meaning than the words alone. If we pride ourselves on diversity and equality, shouldn't our story include Indigenous peoples? In this era of reconciliation, we need to share the truth first. And reimagine the narrative of this land and this city together.
Thank you. So if we go to the next slide, so this is the second year that we have organized and hosted this virtual LSCE meeting. And it's really the hard work of a student group at the University of Toronto, the LSCDS, that made this meeting possible. So I want to acknowledge everyone involved. You can see their faces on the slide, and I'll mention them by first name. So we have Alison, Alex, Tugania, Sophia, Melissa, Ala, Amy, Sophia, Tom, Sophia. And then we have 4 professors involved in this meeting as well, in organizing the meeting. So Professor Reinhard Reitmeier, Professor Roland Andropoulos, and Professor Nana Lee, including myself. We also want to thank the funders. So that's CIHR, University of Toronto School of Graduate Studies, Student Life, the Temerty Faculty of Medicine at the U of T, CSMB, and S2BN. So based on the feedback we got, we kept this meeting virtual really because it seemed to be the best way of having this career-oriented meeting. And as you can see, we have people from all across Canada involved in this meeting. So this is where you, as attendees, come from, all the universities from across Canada. But we also have attendees from other countries, including Nigeria and Africa and New Zealand. So that's really fantastic. And we have almost more than 400 registrants at the meeting. So welcome, everyone. So from last year, we decided to reorganize the meeting a bit based on the feedback that we got. So we organized it based on the idea of what are the stages from thinking about your career to getting that job. So we have initially on day 1, career exploration and learning. Then on day 2, we have job searching and preparation. And on day 3, we have the active job seeking. And we hope that through this expo, you can learn a bit more about your career interests, actively work on developing your professional skills, but more importantly as well, the meeting is really an opportunity to network with others. And this would be extremely important in your active job searches. Next slide, please. So this is the agenda for the meeting. And this is, of course, on our website. We have the 3 days, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And they are divided according to the 3 stages that I mentioned. There are workshops as well as several career panels. And some of these panels are running in parallel, so you can choose the career that you are interested in and attend these different panels and job sims. And this is finally the agenda for today. We will start with our keynote, and then there's a workshop followed by several of these career panels that are all focused on the exploration phase of the professional development. So with that, I will pass my virtual mic to Alison to introduce our keynote speaker. So Alison, all yours.
Thanks so much, Waleed. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Allison. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, and I'm one of the organizers for this event. So today I'll be moderating our keynote session, and this will be formatted more in an interview style. So the session is entitled Graduate School to the Labor Market, Challenges and Opportunities. And we're extremely fortunate to have Dr. Dwayne Benjamin joining us today. He's a professor of economics at the University of Toronto, which he joined after completing his PhD at Princeton. And he's a labor economist whose research has evolved to focus on the economics of higher education. So we'll stop sharing our screen here. And so I'll pose my first question to Dwayne to kind of lead off of that introduction. Can you tell us a bit more about your background, so the different positions that you've held, and how that will frame the perspectives that you'll be sharing with us today?
Well, thank you very much, Allison, and thank you also for the invitation to be here today. It's this is right up the alley of the Canadian Council of Academies report that Reinhard and I'll get to that in more detail, we're working on together. So this is a real privilege for me. In terms of background, I think that probably the most important background that I will talk about, I mean, I could talk about some of the details of jobs I've held or positions I've held within the university later, but I think the most important thing is I'm an economist. And so for better or worse, that tends to frame the way I view a lot of questions. And I just want to sort of be upfront about that we're going to be talking this afternoon about PhD labor market outcomes, and it's going to be very clinical in terms of thinking about jobs and earnings. But I just want to sort of acknowledge that, of course, there's a lot more to a PhD and the pursuit of a PhD, and I fully acknowledge that. But I think that'll be the focus I want to talking about. And one of the things that means, though, as an economist, and as a labor economist in particular, looking at a question like the outcomes of PhD students as they go into the labor market, it's inevitable to think about the labor market as a market itself and the market outcomes, which for an economist or labor economist would be just, employment and earnings types of framing. But also the way we think about education, and certainly in my current role as a vice provost strategic enrollment management, which is more on the undergraduate side, really thinking about students making their decisions to go to university. It's really, we think of that as a human capital investment decision about, I'm going to go to school to improve my productivity so I can increase my earnings in the labor market. So we don't normally think about PhDs that way, but that's what I'll be talking about today. The other sort of factor, which I'm going to spend less time on, is that labor economists also study search. Search as a process, distinguishing feature of labor markets being imperfect information. How do individuals seeking work match up to employers seeking employees? And there's a lot of research on this. But of course, a lot of it's very abstract. It's not going to be like, oh, here's how you find a job. It's really more a recognition that it's hard. That there is just inevitably a search process that is time consuming and costly that everybody has to do. And this is one of the first steps you can take is, attending workshops like this.
Perfect. Thanks, Dwayne. So it sounds like there are a few sort of umbrellas that we can take a look at today with this talk. So the first is sort of your bird's eye view. So your work with the Council of Canadian Academies, looking at things with a very broad perspective at the labor market, and also some of your experiences as vice provost or as a graduate chair. So more of an institutional view about the things that we can kind of do to help graduate students as they go through their programs, or even as they think about going into graduate school. And also, I suppose you were a supervisor as well. So if you have a more personal perspective on that, maybe if we have time, we can ask you about that as well. So why don't we start then with the CCA, the Canadian Council of Academies. So a few questions about this report that you mentioned. So this was the Degrees of Success Expert Panel on the Labor Transition of PhD Graduates. So I'll ask you a series of questions and I think you can kind of delve into it from there. So my first question is, what motivated the CCA to do this report? And then the second, of course, is what were the main findings of this report? So what did they find about PhD outcomes in the labor market? And then if you can also speak more specifically about experiences of students in the life sciences, that would be.
Absolutely. Thanks, Allison. So what I'm going to do is spend, 15 minutes or so just going through some slides, which I think are really help anchor my discussion, or I'll ramble through and we'll burn up all our time as I try to remember things. So I'm going to share my screen and see if I get this right. Okay. So the key thing to note, first of all, who is the CCA? The CCA is the Canadian Council of Academies, and this is really an umbrella organization for the Fellows of the Royal Society, for the comparable organizations in medicine and engineering. So those are really, fairly high up perspective on Canadian Academy. What the CCA does, though, is they do reports. They do expert panels on a variety of topics. You can go to their website and see what they work on. They work on all kinds of cool things. And so they basically bring a variety of people together in multidisciplinary panels to sort of attack various, important questions. And the particular question they were looking at here, they were asked by ISED, which is the Industry Canada, basically, economic development. And Industry Canada, ISED also, they are the ministry that looks at and looks after all our grants. So SHRC, NSERC, CIHR. And they were interested, they're in the business of supporting research and supporting graduate students. And they were really just interested in knowing, well, what's happening to students? And really there is an economic development and research in the economy, and they perceive there obviously being a mismatch. So they asked, what are the main challenges that PhD students in Canada face in transitioning to the labor market, and how does it differ by fields of study? And there was a variety of sub questions. What unique challenges do PhD graduates? Minimize these pictures here. I can't even read my slides. What unique challenges do PhD graduates working in Canada face in launching their careers within academia? What unique challenges do screaming at me. What unique challenges do PhD graduates working in Canada face in launching their careers outside of academia? This will be an important point. And what are the key motivations behind the migration of PhD graduates in and out of Canada? So I'll just leave it at that, the international dimensions. So the expert panel, as I said, is an interdisciplinary panel that was chaired by Elizabeth Cannon, who's the former president of the University of Calgary. And you can see a nice picture of Reinhardt down there. So we were on the same panel together. So it was great. It was a lot of fun. The final report was called Degrees of Success, and it was released early last year. And I'm just going to rip through the findings here, and I'm going to come back to them in a little bit more detail. So the first point was that the number of PhD graduates in Canada is growing, while the number of open tenure track positions is stagnant or declining. The second was that non-academic sectors have not significantly increased their uptake of PhD graduates. Thirdly, and this will be a common theme, the labor market outcomes of PhDs vary significantly by gender and discipline, and the economic return of a PhD is lower for younger graduates compared to PhDs in general. So market conditions have not been great. Fourth, and this is really important, and we can talk more about this, is that academic culture can support or hinder the transition of PhDs to the labor market. So what we do at the university can make a big difference. PhD graduates may not be aware of the skills and abilities they could bring to a future employer, and there may be mismatch between the skills that employers are looking for and those that PhD graduates have during their studies. And these are all, by the way, very high level findings that are not specific to any particular discipline. And lastly, PhD graduates from Canadian institutions are presented with the opportunity, or in some cases, the necessity of seeking employment outside of Canada following their studies. So it's really very a global market for PhDs. So I'm just going to show you some of the numbers that went into to sort of yielding those findings. And my focus will be principally on those labor market outcomes, and then we can talk more generally about what we can do, given the market outcomes, what we can do to support PhD students and what PhD students can do themselves to help improve their labor market outcomes. So the first thing to see here is this a graph that basically shows the number of PhDs awarded in Canada, but adjusting for population. So this is not just the total number growing with population, but this is the per 10,000 number of PhDs. And you can just see this is going higher and higher every year. So on one hand, you've got government policy, you've got provincial policy, federal policy, grants encouraging upskilling and increasing the number of students going to graduate school to PhDs without really knowing necessarily whether, what the outcome is going to be when they go on the market. So there's this big increase in supply. On the academic demand side, you can see that this is a graph of just the number of professors over time. The total professors, you can see there's been a slight increase as time goes on, but the key point to note is that the assistant professors, which is the bottom line here, I'm going to put on a little laser pointer here. This bottom line here is basically flat or declining. There's been a number of changes in post-secondary education in Canada, not least of which was the elimination of mandatory retirement. And so faculty can stay on. It used to be that professors had to retire at age 65. Once that constraint was removed, professors can stay here for a long, long time. And that just significantly reduces the amount of turnover in universities and reduces the number of positions that are going to be opening up. This also has not been a significant increase in the overall scale of the university in terms of employment of professors relative to the number of students. So there's just not a lot of jobs and certainly no evidence of increasing growth in jobs. I'm just going to, okay. So this is what you're going to see when I talk a little bit about the data that we use to try to answer some of these questions and some real constraints in the data. But this just gives you a sense of where people with degrees are working. I showed you the academic labor market, but what about the non-academic market? And you can see that in Canada, it's broken down by men and women, but you can see that, trying to figure out who's working in academia is not that easy with the census data that we have. Basically, I'm just here going to summarize it based on the fraction of people who are working in the educational sector with a particular degree with an educational occupation as well. So let's look at the very bottom row here, which is just the PhDs under 40. So it's looking at newer PhDs. And this is across 3 different censuses, 2006, 11, and 16. And you can see essentially here in this bottom row here that you're looking around 40% of PhDs in Canada are working in the educational sector, in educational jobs. That doesn't include, by the way, there are lots of PhD graduates that work at the University of Toronto in administrative and other leadership positions, but they're not really in an academic position, so an academic occupation. For women, there's been a decline in the proportion of PhDs working in academia as well. This, by the way, means that there are slight increases in the number of PhD students working outside of academia, but it's not really a material large change. So where are those jobs going to come from? The jobs, if they're not in academia, have to come from outside of academia. And this is a graph that we highlight, in big bold fonts in the report, which is, this is a fraction of GDP that's spent, gross expenditures on research and development. And you can see that if you compare Canada, again, I got to get the little marker going here, laser pointer. You can see the Canadian number is lower by far than the OECD average and way lower than the United States, and declining. If you think about one of the main sources of employment outside of a university would be the private sector, government sector, R&D, principally private sector. You can see that Canada is there's very little investment in R&D capacity, which means there's going to be fewer jobs than would exist elsewhere in terms of where PhDs can work. And that's going to be born in the data. So what we'd really like in order to answer the questions that we had been asked to address, would be have a nice longitudinal panel of several cohorts of PhD graduates and other graduates, where you could track their progress after they graduate. You'd know every year what their jobs were. If, for example, in life sciences, you would have postdocs, maybe how many times you're in a postdoc position, and then how long does it take to get a assistant professor job, or what. We'd know a little bit more about how long it took you to get your PhD, because when you leave your PhD is, of course, a decision that PhD students make, and it's not independent of the labor market conditions at the time. We'd like to know earnings. And also we'd like to know information about the job match. Was it a job? Did you get a job that actually lines up with what you were hoping for? Is it a job that is fulfilling? Is it a job that aligns with what your PhD training is in? Right? Those are the kind of questions we'd like to be able to answer. But of course, we don't have those kind of data. So instead, we use data, like I alluded to earlier, from the public use microdata files of the Census of Canada, where you're just looking at very broad brushstrokes of labor market outcomes. There are surveys of graduates, but they're very limited. And for earnings linked to education, there are some really cool resources, which I'll show later, which are linked tax records, which link your income tax records to educational training, but they don't tell you a lot about jobs. So just to show you a little bit of what we can do with tax records, these are earnings of PhD students 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 years after graduation for a particular cohort. And I'll be more specific later. And this is also varying by discipline. So you can see, if you want to make a lot of money, what you would really clearly see in this picture here is that, most of you have all chosen the wrong discipline, right? We all did. Business is by far the discipline where the PhD payoff is the highest. And then you can go and see the different disciplines, and the lowest is humanities, perhaps not surprisingly, right? And this is just earnings, right? It doesn't mean these individuals are working as assistant professors. It doesn't say anything about the sector of employment. It just says, here's how much money you make with your degree. Another key point is that earnings do grow over time. So it's not like they're stuck forever at whatever the starting salary is. And it's this growth in earnings we want to keep in mind as we think about the payoff to PhDs and other degrees later on. This is the average salaries or average earnings of individuals with different levels of education over time. And there's a bewildering number of numbers here. I don't want to get into them all. So I'm just giving you a taste of what's in there. But let me just show you a couple of things. The first thing to note is that for PhD graduates, and I'm going to look at men and women separately, because the outcomes are different. You can see that for men in particular, that and these are adjusted for inflation, that the average earnings of PhDs in Canada have been falling over time. This is adjusting for inflation. For women, the average earnings have actually been but it's still the case that men make more than women on average, right? So that's one important point to note. So one of the questions we wanted to look at then is it the case that if you just looked at a PhD as an investment in human capital, is it worth it? Setting aside all the sort of wonderful things that you gain as a PhD student in terms of experience and knowledge, is it worth it in terms of your time and the cost? One of the thought experiment in particular, to keep it simple, is to compare getting a PhD with just stopping at a master's degree. And assuming, just for sake of argument, that it takes 5 years to get a PhD, which is maybe more relevant in life sciences, less relevant in humanities, but it gives you a sense of, okay, if you're going to do a PhD, you could have stopped at the master's and started working on your career, your earnings are going to grow, and you're kind of in the penalty box, so to speak, in terms of earnings while you accumulate earnings. And then, of course, you graduate from your PhD 5 years later. We'll see where you start relative to what you would have started if you just kept with your master's degree, and we can see how long it takes you to catch up or pass the master, what would have happened if you'd only stayed with the master's. So in order to do this, there are basic techniques we use in labor economics to basically run regressions and see, adjust for age and all that kind of stuff. And I'm going to skip all that to show you what the results look like. But before I show you the fancier results, I'm going to show you the results that basically give you a sense of the thought experiment using the tax records. So these are master's and PhD graduates tracked from years 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And you can see for both men and women. And so if I look at, I'm going to keep the pin here. It's a good way to do it. You can see that for women with a master's degree, oh, it doesn't work. Use a laser pointer instead. You can see for women with a master's degree and a PhD, they basically start at the same point after graduation. With a master's degree, your earnings, they grow over time. For PhDs, for women, their earnings also grow over time. So the question you want to know is, 5 years out with a master's degree, you're still ahead of where the PhD student was when they first graduated. And so you have to sort of track over time, after how many years would it be the PhD graduates would overtake. And you can see the same thing here for men. You can do the same kind of thought experiment. What we find, and I'm going to speed up a little bit here and not get into the weeds of the details here, but basically what we find for men, for graduates under 40, we find a decreasing payoff to getting a PhD relative to having stopped at a master's, and an increasing number of years to the point by 2016 where it was going to take 15 years before a PhD graduate's earnings would catch up to what they would have been if they had stopped just at the master's degree. For women, the story is less bleak in terms of the payoff to a PhD. And again, this is just looking at all PhD students, not specific to life sciences. And you can see that the payoff to a PhD is a lot better in terms of just being marginally coming out ahead, as opposed to taking a master's degree and going on and working. So the big story here is really the declining returns to a PhD over time in Canada. And the reason that's interesting to me as a labor economist is to show you data from another country, to show you from the United States and other really classic picture that we look at these days in labor, is the stark increasing returns to education almost across the board, particularly for bachelor's degrees relative to high school. There's a lot of rising inequality. There's been a variety of contributing forces to the rising inequality, but a big part of the story is the rising returns to skill, rising returns to education. So in most ways, you need to look at the data, more education yields even higher returns. So to see PhD returns falling is somewhat exceptional. So one of the things that I'm doing now is I've taken this project and tried to make it a little bit more academic, because I'm working with a couple of my students, Boriana Milicheva, who's actually finished this year, and Natalia Vigeza, and we're really trying to dig deeper on the supply and demand story here to see if we can understand what's happening between Canada and the United States. I'm going to skip the research questions. So just some early results that we're finding, as you can see, this is using census data in Canada and the United States. In Canada, you can see that the share, get the laser going, the share in academia, as we saw in the earlier census, is around 40%. and that's been pretty stagnant. Whereas in the United States, if you look at PhD graduates, there's a lower fraction of PhD graduates in the US that work in academia, and it's declining. The flip side of that, of course, is that the non-academic sector is increasingly important in the United States, and it's kind of flat in Canada. In terms of earnings, you can see a similar story, right? In Canada, you've got basically a flat set of flat incomes for the non-academic sector, no growth in earnings for the non-academic sector, whereas in the United States, the returns to the income levels, the salary levels for non-academic jobs is rising. In Canada, the academic payoff is relatively high compared to non-academic, so maybe that's why everybody wants an academic job. In the US, there's a bigger gap, and I'm going to give you more information about that in a second. So one of the questions we didn't get into in the report, we didn't have as much data on particular disciplines or results by discipline in there as you might be interested in. So what I wanted to do was to get a little bit more information on life sciences in particular. And so I'm going to just show you a couple of results. I just want to draw your attention, if you haven't seen it already, the 10,000 PhD project focuses on U of T graduates, but it gives you incredible detail. You can go to the SGS website, there's a link there, incredible detail about the kind of jobs that PhD students have gotten by field from the University of Toronto and over time. So it's really a rich source of detail. I'm just going to show you more information about at the higher level, bird's eye view of earnings and employment by sector. So there's a really cool tool, which I provided the link in an earlier slide, that shows you earnings. You can go to a dashboard and it uses tax records, and you can actually compare earnings by discipline, very coarsely defined disciplines over time and by degree. And this picture here, you can see they pool physical and life sciences, so I can't give you the life sciences specifically, but you can see at least relative to business and management or physical and life sciences, the life science earnings and the gap between the PhD and the master's is pretty low, right? The payoff, the distance between the PhD and the master's degrees are going to give you something about the payoff of the degree. And of course, the relative height of these bars tells you the relative payoff to each of these different disciplines for income. This is for men. And these are the results for women, which are again lower, but you can see that again, the percentage payoff to women for getting a PhD tends to be higher. So those pictures are similar to what's in the report. It's just that you can actually go to this website and plug in your favorite program and degrees and cohorts of graduates to get a sense of the earnings. Another really interesting source of data is a survey of earned doctorates, which is conducted in the United States by the National Science Foundation. And they survey graduates every year. And so you can actually track these outcomes over time. What I wanted to show you here was really just the employment sector of US PhD students. And what you can see is if you look at all fields, this is principally the NSF fields, but you can see if you look at academia, again, I might get this laser pointer back. You can see that academia, which is this graph here, is generally declining over time, and it's precipitously declining in the last decade. The share of PhDs going to industry or business is rapidly increasing as a main source of employment. And those patterns are really carried over to the life sciences as well, where you're looking now at over 40% of life science graduates working in the private sector, industry or business in the United States. That's as PhD students. If you look at salaries as well, you can see life science salaries versus, I just pick one, math and computer science, you can see they're not as high. The key point to note though is that the industry salaries are way higher and growing with a growing gap compared to academia, that there's a lot more money to be made. This is where the better paying jobs are. This graph shows you the industry academia difference. It's just the difference, it just takes those graphs I showed you before and takes the difference between the average or the median industry salary versus jobs in academia. And you can see that these, it doesn't really matter which discipline you look at, the graphs are positively sloped, that the payoff, the relative payoff, the better jobs, if you will, in terms of income are outside of academia. And that, again, emphasizes in the United States. And you can see life sciences here that trend holds, but it's even more stark and the differentials are higher in other areas, right? So for example, not surprisingly in math and computer science is the highest payoff to being outside of academia. But even in my own discipline in economics, there's a lot of jobs that are in the tech sector and so on that are emerging now to compete with academia as a source of employment. And the last graph I'm going to show before we go to a totally different set of questions is really just to look at professor salaries. So this is a little bit more distinct because we don't know what academia means. It could mean being a postdoc, it could mean all kinds of things. This is data from the American Association of Universities, and you can get the average salaries of different professors by discipline. And I just chose a couple of examples here. So I've got biology and human physiology as examples of life sciences. And you can just see essentially what's happening here is, without doubt, right? Again, business school salaries are just by far the highest in an institution. Economics comes second, but a very distant second. And you can see, though, that the lines and the growth of earnings in other disciplines has been a little bit slower. This, by the way, is driven, not surprisingly, by supply and demand, right? It's driven by the fact that undergraduate enrollments are, which drive the demand for professors in universities, are most robust, particularly in business, which is essentially the largest program that students take now. So that's to give you background. Really, I think the key takeaway from this is that, at least in the United States and hopefully at some point in Canada, most of the opportunities for employment are going to be outside of academia. And as a PhD student, as a PhD graduate looking for employment, that's where the action is increasingly going to be. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, which means I have to stop the pen. And wait for some, I know you've got some other questions.
Thanks very much, Dwayne, for a really comprehensive overview of the labor market. So we'll switch gears a little bit, as you said, and move now to your experience more as Vice Provost, Vice Dean, Graduate Chair in the Department of Economics. So what do you think departments and faculties can do to support graduate student professional development? So what's currently being done and also what can be done?
Well, I think that one of the themes that we highlighted in the report, but again, the report reflects, I'm sure, Reinhold's experience as well as mine, is the issue of culture within our departments. So in my home department in economics, it was always the case that good students would get non-academic jobs, but it was frequently viewed as like a consolation prize or plan B, not plan A. Plan A was always a really high-ranked academic job. When I became vice dean and saw in the Faculty of Arts and Science and discovered that, hey, not all departments are the same as economics. All these graduate programs are different. But I also spoke with a number of graduate students where there were significant issues within their departments of student mental health and all kinds of issues that really pertain to the tension between supervisors and students regarding their career aspirations and whether they're going to have an academic job or not. It was clearly that this problem was much worse outside of economics than it was in economics. It was bad in humanities, it was bad in sciences. So this kind of tension, this culture, that a perspective on the part of faculty that their jobs as supervisors really was to get their students an academic job, and otherwise it was a failure. That problem is pervasive in universities. And as you saw in the graphs, yeah, if you started your job 20 or 30 years ago as a professor, maybe that was a reasonable assumption, but it is totally divorced from reality at this point, where there is really just non-academic jobs are really plum jobs. They're good jobs, and increasingly they're the jobs we need to be thinking about our students gaining. So that mismatch between the reality of what's happening in the labor market and the way we work and operate our universities is really the first sort of insight that I would think is really important for us to be beginning to address. And how we change that culture just takes a bit of time. one of the ways to do it. Economists don't always have the right perspective on things, but one of the things about the human capital model is we really do, it is a very much the focus on the individual student making a human capital decision, so that it is the student's PhD, not the department's PhD. It's not the supervisor's PhD, it's the student's PhD. It's true with the undergraduate level. When I took over my current role as a vice provost, it was really to make sure that as an institution, we're being student focused on the undergraduate side in terms of all kinds of things. And I thought, well, how could we not be student focused? Isn't that what we do? Well, it's not hard to imagine that a PhD or a department, and I hear this all the time in my own department, the focus is on the program. The focus is on whatever it is, but it's not always about the students. It's not about the individual students that you have in your program that are making, they've made a life decision and a commitment, and they are the ones that have really the agency. They're not there for the professors. They're there principally for themselves. Of course, the professors benefit from having them there. So that perspective shift is somewhat subtle, but I think it's really important, because then you start to have a shift in culture to recognize that we're here for the students, not the other way around. In terms of the kinds of initiatives that I think are really helpful for students and improve, helping their outcomes, there's really two really tangible initiatives that I've seen. First of all is the recognition that communication skills are absolutely critical once you get out in the labor market. They're critical even beyond, it's not just that outside of academia, but inside of academia, communication skills are vital. And I don't think they're really directly addressed. I remember in my own department, it was viewed as, no, we don't have to teach writing. Or if we do, we need to bring in somebody in the English department that knows about writing. And that fails to recognize the fact that the mode of discourse in each discipline is different, and you need to have some tailoring of the discourse. At the same time, there's some general principles of communication that I think can be embedded in our programs, and there's been some attempt made to do that through in arts and science with Professor Dan Newman, who has a degree in evolution, ecology and evolutionary biology, as well as a PhD in English. And I think he's been a really important addition to our graduate supports in the Faculty of Arts and Science. The second is just really focusing on professional development at all, really acknowledging that students need to be able to communicate their academic background to universities, obviously, but they also need to be able to communicate the broader set of skills to potential employers outside of academia. And that's a very different kind of marketing. The other kind of perspectives I've gained for different roles I've had, first of all, just as a PhD student, one of the first things I remember is I was thinking of, where am I going to want to pursue my career? And I had been an undergraduate at the University of Toronto, and I had a joint labor supply, as we call it in economics. My girlfriend had a job in Toronto. I had a kind of a preference for coming back to Canada. And I was very sheepish about raising this with my supervisors. And they said, of course, are you nuts? Of course you should take the job you want. And I think it was really because even as a PhD student, you don't want to let your supervisors down, and you're hoping that you're going to be able to be like a prize placement. And I think that having supervisors really disabuse their students that their placement is for the supervisor, it's really for the student. And so I think being supported by your supervisor in terms of the career you want to pursue is the absolutely most important thing. And it's not universal. It's not universal now that this happens. I see it in my own, even this year on the job market, with my own student or watching other students, that there's pressures to not take this job or not go for that job or not apply for this job, or what are you doing? What are you thinking? You're nuts. That kind of thinking, obviously, it makes sense. It's helpful to provide advice to students, but to really be trying to micromanage their lives, I think is just a huge mistake, but it's baked into a lot of the culture that we have here. I know I don't want to eat up all the time, but I know that you have some other questions that I'll.
Yeah, I think what I'll do, just for the sake of time, is actually turn to the Q&A just so people can have some of their questions answered. So one question is it known why there's a decrease in the number of positions in Canada as opposed to stagnation? Is this due to federal or provincial policies?
No, I think that remember, the total number of professors is rising. It's really the composition of the professors, right? The elimination of mandatory retirement significantly changed. If you think about professors having to retire at 65. Now, many of them work till 75, just as an example, right? That's out of a career of 30 years, that's almost a 33% reduction in the number of positions that are going to become available. I mean, it just changes the rate of turnover in a very mechanical way. And of course, some disciplines are affected more than others because it depends on the age of the professors that are there. So there's just fewer openings. I don't think technological change is going to, I think we were able to teach larger courses, the shift to more online and the mixtures of online. There's bigger economies of scale in teaching. So I think there have been some technological changes that just mean there's going to be fewer professors per student, because there's obviously been significant increases in the number of undergraduates over time.
Great, thank you. The next question is, I was not aware of the extreme low spending in R&D, which even decreased since 2016 under a liberal government. Normally conservatives are famous for cutting research spending. What is the government's rationale for this low spending?
Well, the government's not doing the R&D, right? I think it's really important to know. Government's created an environment. This is principally private sector R&D, right? So that's what the jobs are. So it's the private sector lagging the rest of the world. It's got, so government policy can affect that. It's not easy. It's not an easy needle, right? And it's one of those things you have to almost sort of step back a little bit and you think about the way, what's an economy, right? Canada versus the US. If you think about North America as being one place, Google is going to be in the US. There's not going to be another Google here. They can open up an office here and so on, but we don't have too many of those companies, right? And a lot of bright individuals. What is missing in the PhD labor market results I showed you that I want to look at in future work is a lot of PhD graduates go to the US. And of course, the global dimension is a really important thing to remember, that the opportunities are in the US. The fact that Canada doesn't have all these jobs isn't necessarily a bad thing. I don't mean it's a good thing for Canada, but it's not for a PhD student. It just means you have to move to where the opportunity is. That's one of the, when my student Boriana was on the market this year, right? She had, flyouts or, job seminars in Portugal and other part and in the UK, all over the US. I mean, I think that it really is a global labor market and you have to treat it that way. Because there's just not going to be, if you really constrain yourself to Canada, you're really restricting yourself.
Okay, the next question is regarding health versus science. Does health only refer to professional degrees? Where do medical and health sciences fall? MSc and PhD?
Yeah, I don't know the details of StatsCan, how they define health. I think they're probably pretty tight about it though, right? It's not going to be, if you're doing health related life sciences, if you're doing cell and systems biology, I'm sure it's not counted as health. So, but I don't know if biochemistry would be considered, probably it's not considered health. Health, they probably mean much more narrowly defined health.
That makes sense.
Including professional degrees. It's not specifically academic.
So the next question is, Dwayne, I'd love to hear your thoughts about the Great Resignation and how that impacts recent grads entering the job market and looking for careers, academic or not.
Well, I think the Great Resignation is not happening with professors. So I think that's important to note. And of course, it remains an open question as to how long that's going to persist. What I can tell you, and this is just from my current job in strategic enrollment management, which is the world of registrars, is that there are a lot of jobs in universities, but they're not professor jobs. They're all the jobs that most people never even imagine they would take in supporting students and supporting the operations of universities. So that's where I see the Great Resignation and the difficulty that we have in hiring and replacing people that have IT skills, communication skills, I call it on the ball skills, just talented people. There's a shortage, right? We're in a relatively tight labor market right now. If the labor market starts to soften at all, which is bound to, then I think this Great Resignation will become less of a big deal.
Just where you were touching a little bit on sort of specific skills, there was a question in the chat that I think can relate to that.
Yeah, it says, can you tell us more about specific skills? As I said, communication skills are really vital. I cannot understate that. But what I would say, there are a few other things that really matter. Stuff that I thought, oh, seriously, this is a skill. So one is project management. I really, I Googled what project, I didn't know what it was. And so I Google it, and it just seems like really an empty thing. But at the same time, the ability to really sell yourself as a smart person who can get things done, you could take one of these little tiny micro-credential type of project management courses to put it on your resume. And at least gives you the language of project management, because that is what is probably super scarce in a lot of corporations, a lot of companies and government organizations, is again, smart people who know how to get things done. It seems like a really strange thing to describe, but it is, there's a huge shortage of that skill. And having some background in project management, which, as I said, I still am struck, it just seems like kind of BS to me, but I think it is a real thing. And the ability to do it is real. It's just whether these courses really make a difference. So that's one thing. But I also think that you need to go on the market with rudimentary tech skills, right? You really do need to know how to build a web page. You do need to know how to work with data, to work with charts, having a statistical, I always got a kick out of students. I teach econometrics when at least at the time I taught. If they'd learned, like they'd spent like an hour on Stata or R, they was all right on the resume. And I think they put Excel and all kinds of stuff like that. But I think even though it seems like, oh, seriously, this is hardly like a deep talent, the fact is, if you don't have or are afraid of data or afraid of creating graphs and charts and so on, it's going to really be a significant problem. So it depends on what you've been doing in your PhD, but just a little bit of investment into data skills, tech skills, a bit of web management skills. Those things are really, again, scarce, and I think that's worth having when you go on the job, particularly the private sector market. It's true as a professor too.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dwayne. Well, just in the interest of time, I think we'll wrap things up now. So thank you very much for your perspective on the Canadian labor market and what institutions are doing to help support their graduate students.
My pleasure. I really appreciate the invitation.
Work on. Perfect. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. So our next session will be a workshop starting at the top of the hour. So we will see you there. Thanks very much for joining.